Sage is a new healer that is being introduced into the mix of our existing healers with the release of Endwalker. It fulfills the role of a barrier healer with a very similar playstyle to an existing healer known as White Mage. It has a fairly straightforward healing toolkit and a damage toolkit, but lacks a raid buff in comparison to its direct competition in Scholar. Similar to Scholar though, Sage has a multitude of off-global healing resources while also boasting a much stronger and much more potent global healing toolkit. Sage has a unique ability with Eurkrasia, which gives specific GCD actions an augmented effect. They also have their equivalent to Embrace with Kardia, which enables them to target specific players and heal them with a small potency with every damage spell. When talking about Sage, it's actually kind of difficult to take the same approach as we did in our previous videos, as we have nothing to compare it to similarly to how we discussed with the other healers, since Sage is brand new. So instead of doing an analysis on new skills, we'll look at their whole toolkit and give our thoughts on how the job will play and where it will excel, while also comparing it to Scholar's existing toolkit for ease of understanding. Again, as stated before in our previous videos, all information is tentative and subject to change following the official release of Endwalker. Before we get into anything, it's important to understand how Eurkrasia works, as it's one of the core fundamentals of Sage's toolkit. Eurkrasia is an ability which when used will augment Dosis, Diagnosis, and Prognosis to have different effects. Using Eurkrasia on Dosis will turn Dosis into your Dot's ability, using it on Diagnosis turns it into your single target shield, and using it on Prognosis turns it into your AoE shield. When using Eurkrasia, all spells augmented will cast instantly and have a natural recast of 1.5 seconds, and since using Eurkrasia itself takes 1 second, it means using Eurkrasia plus any combination of abilities will force you into a 2.5 second GCD, regardless of your spell speed. Because using Eurkrasia turns Diagnosis and Prognosis into Sage's cornerstone shielding toolkit, similar to Scholar's Adloquium or Succor, it means that these two shields can be applied within 1 second of when you would need to use them. Or they can even be applied while on the move. This is a very big benefit to Sage when comparing it to Scholar. An interesting thing to note though is that Sage cannot use Swift Cast on Eurkrasian augmented abilities, meaning it's forced into a 1 second cast time regardless of situation. Getting the basics out of the way, Sage is very similar to Scholar in the sense that their toolkit is nearly identical GCD healing wise with a few grievances. Diagnosis is Physic, Eurkrasian Diagnosis is Adloquium, and Eurkrasian Prognosis is Succor. Sage however has one more GCD heal option in a sense with Prognosis, which is an unaugmented version of Eurkrasian Prognosis. This effectively means Sage can spam AoE GCD heals without worrying about overriding shields. This is also probably the reason why Eurkrasian Prognosis has a very weak potency heal when compared to Succor. Now with the basics out of the way, let's start off with one of their core abilities, Kardia. Kardia places a buff on a targeted player, and with every damage GCD you use, it will then heal for 170 potency with the Kardion effect. You can think of this ability as Sage's own closed position if you played the Dancer job. It should be noted however that you can swap targets near instantly without worrying about removing it and reapplying it. This ability enables passive single target healing while Sage uses offensive spells. It's very important to remember this, as healing actions and spells will not trigger the Kardion effect. Kardia is obviously very strong. It can heal specific targets consistently, something Embrace can't do. However, it doesn't come without its disadvantages. Because Kardia only procs on damaged spells, this means when having to utilize GCD heals, or when being forced to disengage casting from the boss either due to downtime or unforeseen circumstances, Kardia will have little to no effect. This acts as a counterbalance measurement to Eos, which is inconsistent, however heals constantly without any restrictions. Kardia can also be buffed with Soteria, which acts as Sage's Fey Union essentially. Soteria is on a 90-second recast and doubles the cure potency of Kardion for 10 seconds, turning it into a 340 potency heal for a maximum of 5 instances of increased healing. This is pretty straightforward and directly associated with Fey Union due to how much Fairy Gauge you actually accumulate in 90 seconds with the use of Aetherflow, enabling you anywhere from 4 to 6 ticks of Fey Union. When comparing Soteria and Fey Union side by side, they are very similar in nature. However, as it's unable to be stockpiled like Fey Union can and requires you to be casting damage spells for those 10 seconds, it can certainly be seen as less versatile to a small extent. Kardia is also slightly stronger as it's doubled in potency, making each instance of healing 340 potency, while Fey Union is only 300 potency. Now let's talk a little bit about Sage's Addersgal system, another core segment of them. Addersgal is Sage's equivalent of Aetherflow. You generate 1 stack every 20 seconds, and players obtain 3 stacks automatically upon entering an instance. Addersgal works very similarly to White Mage's Lilies, where if you have 3 stocked, you stop generating any future Addersgal, and upon death you will also lose all your stocked Addersgal. However, unlike Lilies, it will start regenerating anew after death even if you are not raised. When looking at the Addersgal, it functions very similarly to Aetherflow. Aetherflow gives 3 Aetherflow stacks every 60 seconds, whereas Addersgal generates 1 stack every 20 seconds. When comparing Addersgal and Aetherflow, it's important to note that Addersgal has no damage ability shared within its system like Aetherflow does with Energy Drain. This essentially meaning Addersgal can only be used for healing. Addersgal is not only tied through their healing however, but also tied through their mana as they are reliant on using it for MP regeneration. This is very similar to how Energy Drain works for Scholar in Shadowbringers. Just like every other comparison, both Addersgal and Aetherflow have their ups and downs. Addersgal can be a tiny bit more versatile as it lets you get more abilities off, specifically when you have 2 or more stocked because it lets you use them more consecutively. For a quick example, we can look at a 2-minute timeline. In those 2 minutes, Sage can utilize more Addersgal abilities between Aetherflow windows, not taking into account stack generating abilities such as Recitation, Rizomata, or Dissipation. If stocked properly, this is mainly going to be useful in openers or areas where you can build up the gauge when there is no healing required. This, however, can set you back in upcoming phases when compared to Aetherflow, so it's kind of a double-edged sword, and when Dissipation is used within a 3-minute period of this timeline, it can kind of offset the mix. Addersgal is also very beginner-friendly for spontaneous stack use, where if you expend all 3, you will get a new one within 20 seconds, as opposed to Scholar's 60-second recast. When looking at the abilities utilized by Addersgal, they are very similar to Scholar's Aetherflow actions. While Ixochole and Eurokrasia are exact equivalents of Indomitability and Lustrate, Kerachole and Taurochole have slight differences to their counterparts. Kerachole corresponds to Sacred Soil but is much more versatile. Kerachole snapshots mitigation and healing effects upon use, meaning party members do not need to stay within a radius to gain the effects. Think of this ability as a larger radius collective unconscious with half the cooldown and 10 more seconds of mitigation, and you can understand how insane this ability is. This is one of the best skills in Sage's toolkit and one of the strongest healing abilities in the game overall. When comparing it to Sacred Soil, however, there are some slight differences, as Soil can functionally act as an 18-second cooldown and is 100 potency stronger in healing due to the initial tick of the regen. However, as mentioned earlier, it requires you to stand within the radius to gain these effects. Taurochole is Sage's correspondent to Excogitation. The main differences between the two reside in the fact that Taurochole is 200 potency weaker and is an on-hit heal instead of a heal that procs at a specific HP value, and also has a 10% mitigation effect attached to it. This can make it very strong and can reach potency values beyond Excogitation, particularly in situations with large amounts of damage through tank busters and auto attacks. The value of Taurochole goes up exponentially when utilizing both the heal and the mitigation effect. However, because the heal is activated upon skill use, it can make utilizing both it and the mitigation difficult in common scenarios where you'd want to use it more preemptively for tank busters, as it can be more difficult for you to get full value from the heal as opposed to Excog, which procs after they drop below a certain HP threshold, making it more user-friendly. Taurochole also has no version of a recitation effect, which makes it automatically critical hit, turning Excog into a consistent 1200 potency heal when using a 1.5 times multiplier. When talking about these abilities actually, it's important to bring up how Rizomata interacts with its Addersgal toolkit. Unlike Recitation enabling the usage of only Indomitability and Excogitation for free and making them guaranteed critical hits, Rizomata gives you 1 stack enabling you to use it on Kerachole, something Scholar cannot do with Sacred Soil. While on the topic of Addersgal, let's talk a little bit about Addersting. You can store up to 3 Addersting at a time, and you can generate these stacks when using Eurkrasia Diagnosis once it's fully consumed, similar to how the Blackest Night works. This then grants you access to Toxicon 2, a 330 potency AoE with fall-off damage. Sage has extremely limited mobility when compared to the other healers, as Toxicon and Phlegma are your only instant cast spells. Of these, Phlegma is on a 45-second cooldown and requires you to be in enemy range. The good part, however, is that Toxicon is DPS neutral on a single target, enabling you to move for free versus Rune 2 and White Mage's Lily system. This, however, puts Sage in a very weird spot, as they have no on-demand movement outside of these 2 abilities, which means you're going to want to maximize your Addersting opportunities pre-pull and during downtime by pre-shielding up to 3 targets. When trying to acquire Addersting during encounters, it's going to be very MP intensive, as generating each stack costs 600 MP. Using 1000 MP to cast the shield and then saving 400 MP because Toxicon is a free GCD. This is, however, very dangerous, and when utilizing this technique you have to be sure that your shields will break, otherwise you lose 1000 MP, which is a very large amount and dangerous to your MP economy. Toxicon is also a very strong area of effect damage tool that is going to make optimizing movement during fights with more than 1 targetable enemy very interesting, as you're going to want to reserve as many stacks as possible for these multi-target scenarios. Getting into the rest of Sage's toolkit, they have a lot of abilities which correlate directly to an equivalent in Scholar. First, let's talk about Holos. Holos is a 300 potency AoE heal with a range of 15 yalms on a 60-second recast. This is very similar to Fey Blessing, however it will have a shorter radius by 5 yalms and it will be based off yourself rather than the fairy. We also have Physis, which is an ability very similar to Whispering Dawn with no initial heal and simply being healing over time. This will heal for 100 potency every 3 seconds for a total of 700 potency over 21 seconds and is also on a 60-second recast. Moving on to Physis II. This ability is a 3-minute cooldown that not only heals for 1000 potency over 15 seconds but also increases healing done by spells by 10%. This is pretty similar to the healing aspect of Fey Illumination. While this is a 3-minute cooldown, when used in conjunction with the rest of its toolkit, it is a very strong tool and I think it justifies its lengthy duration. Pepsis is a 15-second cooldown that will turn your already applied shields from Eurkrasian Diagnosis and Eurkrasian Prognosis into a flat potency heal. For Eurkrasian Diagnosis, you will receive a 450 potency heal, and for Eurkrasian Prognosis, you will receive a 350 potency heal. This works almost opposite to how Emergency Tactics works, where you can use the ability and then cast a Succor or Adloquium, whereas Pepsis works after you cast it instead. When speculating about Pepsis maximization, you can also take damage to your shield, but as long as the shield actually doesn't break, then you can still use Pepsis on it, still getting the flat heal value. This can make it very powerful in certain scenarios where you can abuse this aspect. Krasis increases healing actions on a target by 20%, and while this may seem like the weakest of the 4 new healing tools introduced at level 86, it can be fairly strong in the right scenario as it can increase healing actions from not only yourself but also your co-healer and your team as well. The only issue with Krasis is how situational it is, as Aquaveil, Exaltation, and Protraction all have values outside of the healing utility, whereas Krasis doesn't. Sage also has Zoe, which doubles the potency of your next spell casted. When referencing this skill, it's mostly going to be used in conjunction with either Pneuma, turning it into an 800 potency AoE heal, or using it with your Eurkrasian Prognosis, turning it into a 200 potency heal and 640 potency shield. This means while it can act as a deployment tactic substitute of sorts for shielding, you can also utilize it with Pneuma for a hefty burst heal. When comparing Zoe plus your Eurkrasian Prognosis to Adlo Deploy with Recitation, using a crit modifier of 150%, a critical hit Adloquium under no buffs equates to 810 potency. The difference between the two is that Zoe plus Prognosis is not as accessible to buff as most AoE healing increase tools are on long cooldowns or simply better off being used somewhere else for more efficient healing. And Adloquium can be further buffed by single target healing increase tools like Protraction, Thrill of Battle, and Nature's Min, making it very easy to increase in potency. Haima is a 2-minute cooldown that applies 5 stacks of 150 potency shields to a target for 30 seconds, reapplying each shield instantly as they are broken. For any stack not depleted at the end of the 30-second window, the target will receive a 150 potency heal for each remaining stack. This tool will be very strong when utilized for tank HP upkeep through auto attacks or for multi-hit tank busters such as Morn or Umbral Smash. Some players may feel that Haima is underwhelming as it's a 2-minute cooldown that is only 750 potency and may compare to abilities such as Divine Benison or Celestial Intersection. However, keep in mind Sage's entire toolkit when comparing abilities. Haima will also not stack with the next skill we will talk about, which is Panhaima. Panhaima is the AoE version of Haima. It is also a 2-minute cooldown that applies 5 stacks of automatically reapplying shields for 30 seconds, but to the entire party instead of one target. Panhaima also retains the functionality of each stack of the shields remaining at the end of the 30-second window and will heal for 150 potency for each stack remaining. This is a very strong tool and is arguably one of the strongest tools in Sage's toolkit next to Kerachole. It allows for easier HP management of the party in scenarios where there are back-to-back heavy AoEs, such as Shiva Junction, J-Waves, and Fight and Rages, 2 mechanics where damage is delayed throughout the party, like Hello World, Golems, or Worm's Lament. It can also be used for tank busters where both tanks are taking damage. This can be anything from Morn style busters to the buster in Eden's Promise that hits each tank twice. Panhaima is a very versatile tool as it can be used as both a AoE healing tool for both the party and the tanks at the same time. When referring to the Eden's Promise example stated previously, you could use Panhaima at 53 seconds into the fight, catching both Shiva/Titan damage and having it also last for the busters, and then also applying the shield for the Maleficium at 1 minute and 21 seconds. With then the unused shields then helping heal up the party for Shiva Junction. This is really just one example of smart execution of this skill, and it gives the skill some very Astrologian vibes with the timing and thinking outside the box, and I love that aspect of it. If there's also no healing where Panhaima is required within 2 minutes, it can also just be used as a single target healing tool to keep the tank at a sustainable HP level. This will probably be more prominent in dungeons. Now getting into the final skill of Sage, we have Pneuma. Pneuma is a 2-minute cooldown that does damage in a straight line with a potency of 330 with fall-off damage of 50% after the first enemy. It also acts as a 25 Yalm 400 potency AoE heal, 800 potency when combined with Zoe, and applies a 10% mitigation buff to the party for 20 seconds. This is going to act as Sage's Temperance and Expedient equivalent. The interesting thing about Pneuma, however, is that it's a multi-purpose tool. It can act as an AoE damage tool, it can be utilized to be a very strong heal with Zoe equaling 800 potency, or it can just be used as an AoE mitigation tool. Because it has so many different effects, it's going to be interesting to see how players utilize this ability when playing the job. Now let's get into the offensive side of Sage. When talking about Sage's damage rotation, it is very straightforward. You will use Eurkrasia to augment your doses to apply your dot every 30 seconds, and then spam doses until you need to apply your dot again. Between gaps of doses spam, you'll be utilizing Phlegma 3, a 510 potency instant cast AoE GCD spell on a 45-second recast with 2 charges. You can kind of think of this ability similarly to White Mage's Assize, however it does no AoE healing, is on the global cooldown, and requires you to be in melee range. Overall, there's really not too much to Sage about Sage's DPS rotation on single target. It's very simple and very similar to White Mage and Scholar in this regard. You put up your dot every 30 seconds, you spam doses, and you use Phlegma on cooldown and in raid buffs when you can. When getting into the AoE rotation, however, the job gets much more interesting, as you can start utilizing your Discrasia, Toxicon, Pneuma, and Phlegma for multi-attack purposes, which makes fights with 2 or more targets much more interesting to play around with. As an example, in the Epic of Alexander, you'll want to utilize your Eurkrasia Diagnosis pre-pull to let you gain 3 stacks of Addersting for Toxicon, letting you maximize your AoE damage, and once you enter Limit Cut, you'll want to use Eurkrasia Diagnosis 3 more times on targets to enable you 3 more uses of Toxicon for going into Brute Justice and Cruise Chaser phase. This enables small optimizations for Sage, almost similar to building up the Blood Lily during downtime. When talking about Sage's offensive rotation, it should also be noted that they have the least mobility out of all the healers. We touched upon this a little bit earlier, but when talking about Toxicon in a full uptime fight, you'll only be using the 3 initial Toxicons you get at the start of the fight and the Phlegmas you get every 45 seconds. This of course can change with the force usages of your Eurkrasia Diagnosis, however the likelihood of using this ability is very small due to how powerful off global healing is. This can be very bad for Sage in scenarios where you have unplanned movement or force long droughts of movement. When looking at Sage overall, Sage is a very strong barrier healer with a fairly straightforward playstyle. It has a GCD healing toolkit that is nearly identical to Scholar with a few nuances, and has a very solid foundation with the ability to apply shields within a second and on the move, as well as the ability to apply and reapply shields with Haima and Panhaima without worrying about timing. It also has a very strong pure healing side to its toolkit consisting of Kerachole, Ixochole, Physis I and II, Zoe, and Pneuma. It has one of the strongest abilities in the game, Kerachole, and it's able to apply consistent single target healing to one target with Kardia that is tied to its damage spells. This can also be further buffed with Soteria every 90 seconds. Sage is also not punished like Scholar when utilizing Addersgal because it has no damage ability tied to the system. However, when it comes to the GCD healing side of the job, it's punished the heaviest for having to GCD heal due to the high potency of Doses 3 and the loss of Kardia since it only procs when using offensive spells. It's going to be key that players capitalize on Sage's strong off-global healing toolkit to reduce the amount of GCD heals you're forced to do. Sage also has no raid buff in its toolkit, which is going to give it an edge in inexperienced groups who may not be able to maximize upon raid buffs. While Sage is very strong, it does not come without its weaknesses. Sage cannot output as strong of shields as Scholar can and has very limited healing radius abilities outside of Pneuma. It can also not heal when away from the party outside of using abilities like Haima, Panhaima, or Pneuma, which gives its competition an edge in scenarios where you are split away from the party. Sage also has no healing increase ability like Temperance, Dissipation, and Neutral Sect. Sage also suffers more post-death as the majority of their toolkit scales off of them, unlike something like the Fairy, which doesn't suffer the repercussions of weakness or brink of death. So that will be all for the healing analysis going into Endwalker. I'm actually fairly excited to see what Square Enix will bring to us in the expansion, and I'm looking forward to giving you my thoughts on how the jobs play after we get more hands-on with them. I will see you guys in the next video. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, and peace!